Yeah, so with that, we'll go ahead and hand the reins over to you, and we'll ask you to just introduce yourself. And because
Excellent. So hayam natigiwawa hayu masi yatilicum thadwa pi mithlite kabanaga wala. Naga anka di tilicum mithlite kaba kaliwala pi nchiwana. Naga anka di tilicum pi mithlite kaba walamp tuk. Naga dula dala kaba Bureau of Indian Affairs. Naga English dindin. My English name is Eirikr Thorsgaard. Naga Skedian name would be Eirikr skreyja, and my indigenous name given back home would be Tamakinik, which is a derivative to mean respectful younger brother. So I just gave an introduction in my language, saying hello, this is who I am. My people are from the Columbia River and from the intersection down to the Willamette Falls. I'm actually a direct descendant of Lal Bick, or Oregon City John, who signed the treaty in 1855 that gave away most of Oregon City and West Lynn, as well as the falls, to the US government and inevitably Oregon. To kind of give some history on myself, on top of being an Indigenous person, I have had the pleasure of working for my own tribal community as the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for about a decade. Then I moved into federal service, and I've worked for the Army Corps of Engineers as an archaeologist. I worked for Yosemite National Park as a cultural anthropologist and tribal liaison, working with 7 communities down there. Then I moved to the Pacific West region of the National Park Service, where I worked with 187 different tribes and over 100 Native Hawaiian organizations through the National Park Service. And now I work for the Bureau of Indian Affairs as an archaeologist here in the Northwest, where I help 43 different tribes across the greater Pacific Northwest comply with Section 106 of National Historic Preservation Act. Long-winded way to get around to, I, as an Indigenous person playing in the SCA, have had many unique experiences. And one that we were talking about earlier that I want to share was my very first reenactment event that was Western-based. I was young, about 17, and I got invited by a friend to go to a historical reenactment event that was not an SCA event, it was a fringe organization. But I was unaware of what reenactment events were. And the only explanation given to me was, you're supposed to represent a culture prior to 1650. So I went and dug through all of my regalia and pulled out just the loincloth and just my moccasins and just my breastplate and went to my very first event. And the reception was entertaining, to say the least. I got a lot of looks. I had a lot of people come over and ask me what I was trying to represent. I had more than a few people remind me that the historical reenactment is supposed to focus on European history, not New World history. And after a short period of time, my friend found an extra tea tunic, and away I went to Viking, and stayed that way ever since in the SCA. About the only homage to my Indigenous history outside of some of the art pieces that I include in my kit and my soft kit is really the name skreyja. It's the derivative of skreyling. And prior to getting my name passed, I actually used skreyling as my second name. So I was literally Eirikr the Weakling or Eirikr the Indian from my earliest incarnations in the SCA. So that's kind of been my only homage. And that really has started to, I think, change a little bit because the SCA never really felt like a super available and open space for inclusion of Indigenous history. And to be quite honest, the whole point I got involved in the SCA was kind of disconnect from reality, and exploring my Norse heritage was an easy way to do that, right? Do it in the safety of friends and company and learn new things. So having said that though, now that things are starting to change, and there are some tribal folks that are out there that are incorporating, you know, especially the armor with the gentleman we were talking about earlier, Mr. Chalik back east, who's got the Anishinaabe, the Ojibwe regalia that is fit over his hard kit. I am just, it's got me so excited to see that there's these options that I went back to my profession and started looking into the archaeology of warfare and conflict here in my own neck of the woods, because all of a sudden, you know, somebody else showed that the door was open, and I started to think, well, hot dang, maybe I can run and make myself an interesting kit. And actually with that, I'm going to move to a PowerPoint, if you guys are okay with that, and show some pictures and stuff, because I think it will help. So there's me, obviously. On the left is me in regalia in my early mid-20s. On the right is me actually in the West Kingdom. I was at a tourney and had just gotten my brand new shield there and was so excited. When we were talking about some of the indigenous communities of the Pacific Northwest, the map on the left has some basic, simple tribal names. And one of the things that we can talk about is names, but a lot of these names were assigned by the US government or by early settlers. And some of the names actually hold true to the people, and some of them have absolutely no connection to them at all. So here in the Willamette Valley, the largest group was the Kalapuya. The Kalapuya didn't really refer to themselves as Kalapuya. They had individual words for each of their dialects that they used that referred to them as the people, like the Halpam, right? The people of this place. And so as things went on and people started assigning names, it often became because of the use of language or physical attributions like flatheads, which is amusing to me because the Flathead Indians really don't have that practice. My people did. We had to actually press the baby's head so it'd be a straight line from the nose to the crown of the head. It was considered to be a mark of beauty. And if you didn't have it, you were actually considered a slave. But those things don't happen anymore. On the right is the list of the tribes, and you can see the reservations marked. The amount of land obviously is pretty shrunk in that short period of time. And most of the tribes now are confederacies. My own community, I'm going to use a cursor here, is right here. And it has about 10,000 acres from what was most of Western Oregon. Basically everything from here, like this, was part of our original lands, and we have that. Our sister reservation, the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians, is right here. Literally the exact same thing, except they have folks that came from the whole coast. And then there's also the Coos and the Coquille. And there's 9 tribes in Oregon, 40 in Washington, quite a few in Idaho. Here we are. So this is where my research started to get all excited. Is I was aware already that there was armor in the Pacific Northwest. And not only that, but a lot of it came from the Columbia River. The early ethnographic records show and display the use of what they call clamons, or like heavy leather armor. And obviously getting a description out of it from the 1830s through the 1870s is fantastic, but finding an actual copy of one is much more problematic. This image on the left is the only example, and it's at the Field Museum, and is the last clamons from the Columbia River that exists. And on the right is an artist's interpretation of what that clamons may have looked like. I'm not really sure that I agree with his interpretation. His interpretation brings the clamons all the way down to his ankle, and some of the descriptions talk about that, but I don't think that that would have been very effective for fighting. I started looking at some of the clamons that were used in other neighboring tribes, specifically moving further up north, and the Tlingit, the Haida, and the Kwakiutl, and some of those folks have really, really elaborate armors. And you can see these clamons, these leather armors, are made out of elk hide and are used as the main form of body protection. In addition, there's this slat armor and rod armor that was used. This same stuff was used in Oregon too, but to a lesser extent. You can see here's a close-up of one of the slat armors. So as my interest in this comes along, here in Oregon in the Columbia River, I know that we had the clamons, and that's easy to replicate. I can replicate most of what would be useful for the body and the arms and the legs, but the head armor is right where we become difficult. There was no real head armor here on the Columbia River outside of heavily woven, like plated cedar bark. And so the closest helm designs actually come from the Tlingit and the Haida up in Alaska. And this is actually a recreation of one that's made out of wood on the left. And so what I did is I actually contacted somebody who's a really fantastic metal worker, Vrin Thomasino, and Master Vrin has agreed to make me the helm that we have looked at here on the right, which is a interpretation of the Macaw, or the Tlingit war helmets, but done in a way that is incorporating all of the art off of the Willamette Falls, where my people came from. So rather than using the art from the folks up north, we're using something a little bit closer to home. One of the things I think is good for other folks to know about and to think about really is that the research problems you're going to find about indigenous communities, finding it here in the United States, is access to archaeological reports. you won't get them unless you go to a university library, or if occasionally some people load them up onto the internet. But the vast amount of archaeological literature and reports are not accessible to the public, and you have to have a master's degree in archaeology and meet the Secretary of Interior qualifications to get access to it. And so that creates kind of a barrier, and that's a barrier that even tribal folks would have doing research on their own communities. The benefit that they have is if they know the people in their community, they can go to their culture department and kind of get access to those behind the door, behind the screens a little bit. Access to community could be a big issue if somebody was looking to kind of represent a community. I don't know that I would recommend that unless you are a direct descendant of those folks in that community that you're wanting to represent. I'm only looking to do it now at this point in my life when I'm in my mid 40s, because I've started to feel comfortable enough with that. And the SCA has kind of broadened its horizons a little bit and incorporated a new shore that is a little bit more open for me to do that. The other thing is that the abundance of gray literature and hard to find first prints. The vast majority of stuff that you're going to find on Indigenous communities is hidden away in universities and archives and back in Washington, D.C. And so not knowing the right people who already have access to those or copies of them, or not knowing where to start that research could be really problematic. And there's also a big problem between historical accounts versus ethnographies. And the big point with this is whether or not somebody is trained to actually do research with Indigenous communities and ask the right questions to get the right answers. And even inside of those ethnographies, a lot of stuff gets lost, because when most of those were being done, it was in the 1850s, right? So they were men, white men coming into a native community, only asking the men questions. So a lot of the ethnographies left out women's voices and children's voices and elders' voices. And some of them get included with some of them, right? But it's not as inclusive as what we would look to do today as a type of research. What's kind of interesting to me is hearkening back to that Eirikr skreyja, right? The Eirikr the Indian and the Viking stuff, is I looked into the research of the communities from the Newfoundland area because I was interested in what that contact may have looked like, with the Los Ann Meadows archaeological site and stuff. And the Beothuk community that used to live in that area, the literature says that they're extinct. I'm a little hesitant to agree with that. I would probably want to talk to the Wabanaki people and the Penobscot, them to get their stories about it. But the same ethnographer that worked with the Beothuk came all the way out to Oregon in the 1850s and actually did ethnographic and language work in my own community. And there's quite a bit of literature that he wrote that is useful today in research, which is amazing that somebody interacted with that community on the other side of the New World and then came all the way over here and was doing the exact same type of work of just trying to salvage what he thought was going to get lost. And luckily he was wrong, but at the same time, a lot of things change. Things are not the same on tribal communities as they used to be. They've had to adapt. Nobody lives in teepees anymore, So having said that, I would really like to open this up to like a question. Yes, and it was the Natural History Museum in Chicago, the Field Museum, for the Clammets. But I would love to open the floor up and answer questions from folks and just have like a dialogue, because I think that's going to be far more useful than any kind of a lecture that I could give, because I'm probably going to put people to sleep if I'm left to that.
Okay. So, hi, I'm Moon. I'm from An Tir. I'm actually one of the other Skraylings.
Excellent.
In fact, I think I am doing the talk on the 19th.
Excellent.
So I guess my question is, what kind of pushback do you get?
Ooh, when I got that real big pushback at the beginning, I never really made the attempt again. And, now I'm kind of older and I'm more surly and less likely to listen to people. And not only that, but seeing somebody else do it, and not only do it, but make it look good, and kind of set an inspiration, I think, for me. So it's only been really recently that I've started to think about bringing some of my own Indigenous history and perspective into things in the SCA, because up till now, it's just kind of been the place to go and hang out with friends around the fireplace and talk about Viking stuff. And, the no joke, there I was because we were on the battlefield stories.
Right.
it's just changed a lot. You know, I think the one thing that I have done is at West An Tir War, An Tir West War every year, a lot of times I've ended up camping with the Summit's Army or variations of it. And in almost every year, I end up getting hoodwinked into telling like old Indian stories. Because in my community, I used to do storytelling for the kids when I worked there. And so I would get roped into telling stories during the war at night. And for folks that aren't familiar with Indian stories are very graphic and ribald and very adult oriented. And especially stories out in the Pacific Northwest with trickster figures. And so some of the stories are not necessarily conducive towards children. And it's always amusing to me when people are like, Eric, tell a story. And I'm like, well, who's in the audience, first of all? And then second of all, are they going to be offended if I start, you know, talking about something that's really graphic? You know, whether it's a simple story like Tadaklia, the giant ogre woman who hunts down bad children and tries to eat them and cook them in a fire, which can be quite scary for kids if it's done right. Or we're talking about how Coyote had his phallus removed with a knife because he tried to take advantage of a young woman, and she cut it off and threw it on the bank of the river and it turned into a rock. That's Rooster Rock on the Columbia River for those of you who live here in the area.
I'll remember that when we invite you into our camp. Don't worry.
Yeah. Just be careful with what stories I'm telling.
Yeah, we tend to have lots of kids in the camp. But so I don't know. I'd like to hear more about how you're looking to incorporate things into your kit. Although I see Marl has a question. She says,
Yes.
Do you know any Indigenous peoples that used heraldry? She's into that.
I believe that there were some of the warrior societies out on the plains that probably did. Out here, things were way more individualistic. So the Clamans, as you saw, they had all sorts of different styles of art on them. People painted what were supposed to be attributions to whatever spirits that they had a relationship that could protect them. And so they would put that graphic image on their armor as a way to create additional protection. And so the thought was it was the spirits as well as the armor that would protect you. And then you could just, you know, run amok and do whatever you want. And so there's not a whole lot of uniformity. There is more if you get up towards like the Pacific Northwest, up towards Alaska and up into the Puget Sound, because their art becomes much more formalized and their clan systems are pretty elaborate. But on the Columbia River, we didn't have a really elaborate clan system. We just had chiefs and commoners and slaves. And then everybody else came to trade because we had all of the constrictions on the river where the fish congregated, right? With Celilo Falls for the Wishram and Wasco upriver. And down at Oregon City Falls, there was the Clawley and the Clackamas. So we had the chokeholds for resources. And so people came from far and wide. So we didn't have to necessarily always be involved in conflict, but for some reason, our armor was preferred for people up north when they were going to conflict. So most of the Clamans that were manufactured here in the Oregon area, all the literature talks about it being actually picked up by Spanish and British ships that are trading up and going to Alaska and trading it off to the Tlingit and the Haida to use in their conflicts between each other and with the Russians. And so it's just fascinating to me. It's like this whole trade network on elk skins. And then all of a sudden the population densities start to drop and the Indians get displaced to the reservations. And then everybody goes, where'd all the elk go? It's like, well, we kind of took care of that problem and sent them all up north as armor already. And then you guys kicked us off our land. So I don't know.
So someone had a question about the word for the armor.
Clamans. Clamons.
Okay.
And it's a Chinook word. Chinook is in a language that was spoke mostly on the Columbia River. There's variations of it from the lower Chinook folks with Cathlamet and Willapa Bay or Klatskanai. So there's lots of different variations, but the Clamans word is the word for the armor. I'm not sure if there's like a breakdown on it for other meanings. It's never been described to me with any other meanings. So.
Okay. And can I circle back to the heraldry question?
Oh yeah.
So, do you have any of that incorporated into your heraldry yet, and or do you plan to?
I do plan to. Actually, I have a piece of art that's going to go along with the helm that I'm going to be painting onto my Clamans that I'm going to slowly incorporate into various elements of my both soft and hard kit. I mean, obviously with the hard kit, it'll be pretty glaring if I'm wearing a Clammons and a hat that looks like it's carved out of wood. I mean, it's going to be pretty sore thumb out there on the warfield. So the unfortunate thing is that I could not find any research to identify shields in our area, with the exception of 2 mentions of round shields that were about 20 inches around. So I'm going to have to real quickly learn how to fight with a buckler well and with a really, really short sword, because that's all we had was clubs. So there's going to be a whole new learned advantage for me, I guess.
It's an opportunity for growth.
Absolutely.
So someone has a question here. When you talk about getting stories from a community, what does that look like to you?
Ooh, so are we talking about like myths, or are we talking about like familial fun stories? If we're talking about like creation stories, econom, those kinds of stories are owned. Like you can't get those from somebody. They have to be gifted to you. You could buy them, which I've seen done on occasion, but usually they're gifted from somebody who's a storyteller to somebody else, and then they get the story of where the story came from and why it's told that way and what the meanings are behind it. Because there's cultural meanings that are kind of embedded in it, and some of them are really obvious, some of them are not. And so, you know, the storyteller's responsibility is to not only make the story entertaining, but also to make sure that those cultural lessons are embedded in there as well. And that if they're not picked up, that they're reinforced in another way. And so getting stories like that would be a little bit more difficult than like a story about a conflict that was told from an elder in the 1870s to a journalist. Like that's a story that's kind of out in the public and communities. And some tribal communities are not even supportive of people accessing like the ethnographic record with the edited original interviews with elders. The woman who shared a lot about the Clackamas people, Victoria Howard, here in Oregon, shared with him over the course of about 3 years with Melville Jacobs, and then died. She got struck by a car. And everybody in the community was like, well, that's because she told the stories out of season and had them recorded. And so she gave up her life to make sure that those things never got forgot. And that's the way I've heard some of the elders in the community mention it. Like she literally gave those stories to get recorded, knowing she was going to die. That was the consequence of having those things written down. And I know it sounds like really kind of poetic and dramatic, but for the community, that's the way it is. You know, if that's the way it's explained, and that's the way it was, and that's the way she did it, and that's why. And so we live with the gift that she gave us. Let's see. Somebody's either, but you were referencing contacting communities in Newfoundland to check history. Actually, what I did is I went through and started looking for everything I could through JSTOR on communities that were in Newfoundland. And specifically, I was looking for descriptions of material culture. Because, when I was thinking about incorporating more Indigenous persona into my own, I thought about trying to use something from the Newfoundland area or that area because they had the contact with the Vikings. But over time, even as an Indigenous person, I'm not comfortable representing somebody else's community. Like that makes me really, really kind of feel almost uneasy, the thought of it. So rather than incorporate their history into my persona in the SCA, I just thought it would be much easier to segue and put it away. And then now that these other opportunities have, opened up, I've got another opportunity to look a little closer to home, which is fantastic. So.
Yeah, Clovis and I, that has been one of the conversations. We've had a lot of conversations around this topic, and that has been one of our conversations, is that these are living cultures in a way that a lot of our other SCA reenactment options are not. And so that can make it, it makes it a very delicate balance between bringing forward history that is 100% relevant to our period and our exploration of what life was like in a different period and in a different place sometimes. Clearly not if we're looking right here, but we have to be very careful about the fact that this is somebody else's life and culture that is currently in existence.
That's the hard part, is that power dynamic, I think. And
yeah.
There's not a good answer. I mean, that's one of the things that has to be said, right? And yes. I said this earlier, if you're descended from that community, by all means, you should explore the history of your own, lineage and get to understand that. But when it comes to the representation piece, it even becomes problematic, like between descendant and, tribal member who's enrolled and active in their community. Like, what's more appropriate? A person whose great grandmother was connected to community, but they don't know anything about it other than that simple connection, or the person who grew up in their community and goes to the ceremonies and is involved and participates and speaks their language. Like, and then when the person who's in that position on the reservation looks and sees somebody else representing them, then they're like, where's that come from? Like, who are you? Where'd you come from? Oh, let's see. There's somebody had a question about vegetables.
That would be Duchess Eleanor.
It's a good topic, though. I mean, that's a fantastic one, and we should talk about it. There's another one here, too. Let's see. I have heard some tribes have specifically asked the SCA to not recreate their cultures. Do you know if there are any? There's a list of which ones. I do not know of a list. It would not surprise me if there is kind of a working list out there. I do know that there are some communities that would be more receptive to it than others. I've worked with a lot of communities here in the area, and there are some that I would probably recommend if somebody was like, hey, I want to go be those folks. I would probably be like, so you should go ahead and do that, but make sure that they never see you because you might get mugged, So with some of them, you don't mess around, Some folks, it's not a joking matter,
Can I add to that?
Yeah.
There are serious rules when you go to a reservation or anything else of when you want to talk to people. And it varies by tribe, by reservation, sometimes even by clan, and it can even like clan town within a clan.
So I always like to say every tribe has at least two ways of doing things, right? And so like my community, the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, that word confederation, there are 30 different tribes and bands from 5 different major languages that were all shoved on one little reservation. So that means there's 60 ways to do anything before we even got to the table. Imagine trying to get something done when, that many people show up from different communities that are in some cases historical enemies. Like there's old notes from elders in the community that are like, oh, those Inatai Tilcham, those other people, because they live on the other side of the reservation, and that means they're from the other treaty. And that stuff even still goes on sometimes in some communities, and it's
well, and it's like it goes back to your stuff on looking through things in Newfoundland and stuff like that. There are tribes up there like the Micmac who have Professor Prince, who is considered almost a legal member of the tribe so that he can speak for them in court.
Yeah. And I've seen tribes, elevate people that were specialists in their community or their history to do stuff like that. Here in Oregon, I've seen folks hire people that were experts that are non-Indigenous. That's kind of shifting a little bit more now because a lot more tribal folks are starting to get advanced degrees. So that paradigm's shifting slowly, but yeah, there is some unique things. So the vegetable question, I want to get back to that. Eleanor, what did you want to know about vegetables?
So I'm a huge history of vegetable geek.
No worries.
And with that, well, thank you for sharing all these. Thank you for sharing. This is great. So with that, with the vegetable topic, so with all the amazing and I'm sorry, I'm stumbling over my words because I'm still formulating the question in my brain. But I would love to seek your advice on how to navigate the food sovereignty, the seeds being taken, being translated. That's a very thick.
It is. That's a bigger issue though in like Latin American countries and Southeast Asia and then Africa, where those corporations are kind of like taking traditional ecological knowledge and the seeds and then like, putting their patent on it and running it away. Here in the US, there's less of that issue. It's actually more of tribes trying to push for access to get those traditional foods. The relocations that happened in some cases were so abrupt that people were removed from their traditional foods. And so the staples of their diets changed overnight. They went from things like yampa root and biscuit root and camas and acorns and salmon and deer and elk to, lard and wheat, flour, and sugar. And that's a huge dynamic change in the diet. And it had a lot of health effects on a lot of tribal communities. But now the big push from a lot of them is to get re-access to those things, to keep them involved in the culture. And for some communities like the Umatilla, they actually have their own first food like initiative. Like they're acquiring lands and working cooperatively with federal and state agencies to manage it so that they can go out and gather on those locations to get those traditional foods and medicines and bring them home. And I always think those things are fantastic. You know, I get more worried sometimes with places like Portland, Oregon, you know, right here in my own backyard, because a lot of the places where they could be advocacy for that food sovereignty for, let's say, Indigenous people that are in a metropolitan area, right? They're not able to go home. They can't experience those things. But if there were traditional foods put inside of the city that they had access to, maybe they could use those. But all the city parks in Portland, most of them are built on old landfills. So you get into the question of like, well, do you really want to give people traditional food that might not be so beneficial in the long run, you know? And some of those traditional foods like Wapato leach heavy metals. And Wapato grows in standing water where there coincidentally is the biggest concentrations of duck and mallard and geese hunting. And that's where lead shot used to be used. And so sometimes there's lead toxicity that can come from eating traditional roots and foods as well, which is another set of issues. So I would say that if you're interested in those first food initiatives, I would start with looking at Umatilla's website and then start doing some research on like First Nations and Indigenous communities food initiatives, because there's a lot of them out there. And actually a lot of them seek partnerships with folks because there's never enough people looking to help improve access to traditional foods, you know.
Great, thank you very much.
Wapato, what is Wapato? Wapato is a small potato-like tuber that grows in standing water, mostly in Western Oregon and Southwest Washington, and it has a large arrow-shaped leaf. Yes, the recipes, there's quite a few tribes that are actually putting out recipe books as well. There's a few folks, even in my own community, who are starting to try to run around and gather recipes from different families to put together little recipe books. My own community also did something, I want to say, with, there was like a chef that came and we did an eel. My cousin, Greg Archuleta, did like a thing with eels at the falls, and they cooked eels. And if anybody's ever seen Pacific lamprey, they're one of the ugliest creatures in the world. And they look like a horror. They taste fantastic though. But if you don't grow up eating them, the description I've heard given to me of eating eels is something like a burnt tire and fish. It doesn't taste like that to me, but I grew up with it, so I guess there's a difference there. Does anybody else have any other questions?
I have lots and lots of questions, but we may have to talk.
Well, we could fill space for everybody else. There was somebody who actually wanted to ask a history question about Oregon.
I think we would just let you talk and talk and talk, and and then be like, oh wait, can you go on that one question we had? But
well, I know that the barony had asked me to do a presentation at before this one came up at what was the event? Fessa was going to be taking care of that one. She was going to have me come do a presentation about Western Oregon tribal history, where I was going to get more into like the specifics about contact time and population loss and the movements of people and where certain folks went and didn't go and other things. And, you know, those are things that we can get into. The problem with those stories though, is like, it always becomes the problem where people start to feel like a sense of guilt because of the historical things that occurred. And like, I always try to remind people that, like, you know, it is a horrible story and you should remember it so it doesn't get repeated. But remember that it's only horrible if you want it to be, because to me, it's a beautiful story because it's all those people that persevered, even given all the odds stacked against them. Like every one of those elders and folks in the community who decided that, you know, we may not have everything we need, but we're going to make more out of it than anyone expected. And they did. Every one of those tribal communities, you know. And to me, that is absolutely a beautiful thing. So
I have a question. What about historical logic? What were people living in historic times?
So this is actually a great question. During the summertime here in Western Oregon, most folks just slept out in the open or would make like lean-tos out of available branches. During the wintertime, there was large plank houses that were constructed, some of them several hundred feet long. that could house multiple families that were kind of like partitioned up. One of the things that I've had difficulty in thinking about how to incorporate like my native stuff into the SCA is specifically we event during the summer. My people during the summer wore nothing. So how to incorporate, wearing nothing into an SCA event. I mean, I could just run around in street clothes and be like, but I think that would lose the flavor of it. So we've been going back and looking at like some of the early regalia pieces that we use to note like social status and trying to figure out how to bring and incorporate some of those into the SCA. And so my wife has been helping me try to look and identify how we can make that happen.
So a t-shirt that says, "I'm naked, ask me why," wouldn't cut it.
The first time I had to give a description about that, it was a living history museum that wanted me to come in full regalia like they were prior to contact and speak to a bunch of children. And I had to like stop and breathe because the first thing I wanted to do was laugh. And then I had to tell them like, I can't do it in traditional regalia because that would be nude. And if I do that in front of children, I'm going to get arrested and you're going to be facilitating something that's horrible. And like, let's have a different conversation. And I think a lot of times there's such ignorance about tribal communities and their early history because of a lack of access to that information that it makes it easy for us to become hidden people in our own world, right? And some of it is kind of like acculturated into the larger whole with the use of like names and stuff. I mean, here in Oregon, there's all sorts of Indian names used on stuff. Clackamas, Wasco, they steal all the Indian names and put them on streets and hills and all sorts of stuff. So
good to know.
Moon, something's chomping at your bit. I could see it. Let's go.
Okay, so I am just now 46, and I've been in the SCA now for almost 31 years. But I've always been Moon. I've always done a skreyling persona. So I've got kind of a opposite.
I'm envious of you in that regard because I didn't have the bravery to do it earlier.
Well, see, don't be though, because it has been rough. So for me, well, like speaking of clothes, so it's interesting that you went with a Viking persona, because I went with the reverse land bridge theory.
Oh,
I was a native who went the other direction, and at the time, they were still arguing over who discovered America first. And I'm like, I'm right here. And everybody else is like, what? I was like,
yeah. If there's people there, it might be occupied.
Right. And I was actually, so since this is all pre-internet things, it's like, I am not a tribal enrolled member. We're one of those families that went, no.
Yeah.
We don't want any part of that. I actually sat with Wilma Mankiller at one of her last lectures before she passed away, and she offered it to my dad, and I watched him say no. And I was
membership on tribes in the back east is so much more complicated than it is out here.
Well, and I wasn't. If I had known what I was losing then, I probably would have spoken up a whole lot. But I was only 17 at the time, so I'm just like, "What are we doing?" And he's like, "Just no." He explained to me why later, but it sucked. But one of the things I've kind of gone through is people like archaeology was not on my side. Oral tradition was not on my side. I was lucky in that I actually took classes from Harold Prinz because he teaches at K-State. When I started out in college, I was actually in culture and anthropology for a while. Took everything of his I could. So he, for everybody else that doesn't know, he actually works specifically with the Micmac near Uplands Meadows, all of that. He is one of their non-Indigenous
experts,
legal witness. He's their guy, and he's Dutch. He's actually from Amsterdam. So I got a lot of hints at things that went the other direction. So, but my family is mixed. So my dad is, he's half Norse, he's half Cherokee. That's what I went with. And I ran with it because it was all I knew. So I took my persona, I made it. Okay, I've been brought up on these stories of these guys wandering around, seeing what there was to see. And then everybody I ran into when I first started was a Norseman, because An Tir is an Anglo-Saxon kingdom, no matter what they tell you.
I wish I could make some claim to that, but my actual name is Eirikr Thorsgaard, spelled just like it is there. And you can't get more Norse than that, you know. So the dad's side, it was easy to go with the Norwegian thing.
Well, my last name is actually Polensky. And when they left Europe, it was still Prussia.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually saw what was that, Catholic confirmation of like one of my great grandfathers that was still spelt in Swedish, I think. And it was like 13 letters long. It was,
oh yeah,
it was ridiculous.
Atrocious names.
Right. So I went that other way, but I also got, on a regular basis, I got the, well, hey, we got some blankets over here. Or,
Wow.
what is moon anyway?
Hmm.
Well, let me tell you. They're like, well, that's not real. So literally, well, even though archaeology has slowly been more on my side of like, this is a what if Marvel comic.
Yeah.
From the DNA in Iceland of, everybody's related to literally 50 native women to, Lansdowne Meadows, the works, everything's there. And I'm like, hey, this is cool. And they're like, yeah, that kind of harshes my medieval mellow, man, because nobody existed before 1492, which I'm sure when you would look for things, it's like it gets to a point of colonization, it stops. So for you,
that clock thing is really pervasive. I mean, that whole assumption that for some reason indigenous communities froze at the moment of contact and quit being indigenous somehow, simply by their contact.
Well, it's like I went to Dilligwa in Oklahoma to their Living History Museum. 1710 point of contact. I'm like, why? And they made a point, like, this is where we were when everything changed.
That issue, actually, when I was at the National Park Service at Yosemite National Park, we had Indian demonstrators that worked in the museum, and they would dress as if it was the contact era, 1860s, 1870s. And so they were dressing as, mixed Indians wearing Anglo clothes. And they actually petitioned and got their uniforms changed so that now they're wearing a professional looking uniform that says their name and where their tribal community of origin is from. And so, they had to do that advocacy on their own. Like, even a federal agency that is supposed to be seen as doing demonstration of cultural inclusion was clueless. And.
Oh yeah. Well, and it's like, so like when they took that picture of Edward and his girlfriend, and everybody's like, oh, the hair on the helmet, and then there was, were you like, holy crap, I can do this? I was like, oh man. Because the first thing I heard is like, hey, did you see this? Why can't you do something like that?
Why were they making a comparison? I mean, it's a completely different animal.
Because to them, it was acceptable now. I've always just been moved. I've been on this weird sideline thing. So here's the other thing. I also had to deal with the heydays of Ish. So for you guys who don't know who Sir Ish is, he lives in, I think, the middle right now. He's actually Master Andrixo's former college roommate, who does An Tir trim. He's actually been a friend of mine for a very long time. And he actually claims but he is a white man who does a Jaguar war. I think he's Knight and a Laurel now for it too.
Yeah, I've seen pictures of him out there. I haven't had an opportunity to ever meet
He's
him.
actually a really nice guy. He's like the rest of us. He totally geeks out and nerds out about, all the cool stuff. But it's like you walk in and you're like, hey, I'd like to do this thing. And they're like, oh yeah, well, we got him. I'm like, oh man. So I've had literally that opposite
Interesting.
thing.
Oh, another question popped up here. I'm not sure how to frame the question, but do you see parallels among pre-Christian Europeans and Native American cultures? I don't know if parallels would be the exact word that I would use. I think that there are some elements of the cultures that are very similar to each other. Specifically here in the Pacific Northwest and with the Nordic cultures, a lot of the art during the 9th, 10th, and 11th century, that real Norsey looking stuff that starts to have the more angular lines, looks like Columbia River art to me. And so I see some similarities in that. When it comes to cultural practice, though, there's some huge, huge differences even with the pre-Christianity piece. And the biggest thing is really there was a lack of domesticated animals, and here in the US, and with the exception of maybe the turkey and some folks with eagles down in the Southwest that I've heard about caring for those, but it wasn't like a normal thing. We had dogs. That was the extent, at least here in the local area of Oregon. And so without having the ability to have an animal that can do that extra labor, it makes it difficult to have things that will make that jump. And we also didn't have metal, at least not in a way that was smeltable that we were familiar with. During the earlier periods, right prior to contact and at contact here in the Pacific Northwest, we actually had copper that was being mined locally and hammered into large plates that sometimes were used as a wealth display item, or they would be carved into clubs. These they call them clubs, but they literally look like little short swords. They're little ensiform clubs that range between like 12 inches and 40 inches long. And they kind of look like a spearhead. And then they have a ring at the end often. And so these clubs were made out of copper, a local copper, and were basically used to run around and threaten people, I guess. No, they're wealth display items. You don't have to use something like that. If you swing a copper club at somebody, you get one use out of it, and then you're out hammering it again. So it really is about a display of wealth, because a person who had wealth in the area would not have to worry about conflict, because people would be worried about them. They'd be, well, they're going to have all their followers come get me, and they probably have big spirit power. And, is it worth killing that one big rich guy if I can instead like kidnap his canoe maker, and then he can't make any new canoes and I can get out of here?
Probably lifestyle similarities too. As like for like northern tribes is going to be like lots of fishing. Well, this is how we live off this, not huge boats, smaller boats.
Smaller boats, but we had sails, amazingly. And the other thing that kind of is interesting is the fish processing, with the exception of pickling, is very similar. So, because they were both doing salmon, right? Norse cultures and the Pacific Northwest. So salmon dominated extraction industries, until agriculture kind of made the big preempt over there in Norway, and then things went different. So.
Oh, and walrus hunting. Well, like especially for like Newfoundland and that area, the walrus hunting between the Inuit, Micmac, and then the Norse that went to Greenland and Iceland, because they're going for ivory, they're going for food. There's no way they didn't interact.
Oh, it's just a matter of time till there's more evidence. It's always amazing to me, because you see things like these Chinese coins. Like I showed the PowerPoint earlier with the clamens that had all the I Ching coins hanging on it. And maybe I'll pull that back up again, because it is interesting to look at. Oh, I guess I don't have the I Ching one. There is a version of one that is a vest, and it has I Ching coins tied all over the front of it as a way of creating additional armor. And some of those versions are post-contact, so it's obvious, trade to get access to those coins. Some of it is pre-contact. And so the question is how did they get these Chinese coins? They're probably coming over on floats and junkers and other things, that just kind of happened to come over.
I know there's a controversial account that one of the Chinese explorers came over pre-1492. So
have you read the account?
No.
I read a version translated into English, and apparently all the Indians here dressed just like Chinese people and spoke Chinese.
Oh yeah.
What?
But
So,
the ship that he was sailing was very impressive, and I would see that it was a possibility that he could make a trip across the Pacific in that massive treasure junk.
they certainly had the technology and the means, and again, I was mentioning like these weird things that pop up in the archaeological record, like floats and coins in San Francisco Bay that are obviously pre-contact.
Anchors.
No.
Anchors. Oh yeah. We have the same thing where there was an early shipwreck on the Oregon coast, and nobody ever found the people that came from it, but several generations later, they attribute one tribe having one individual that had red hair. And they're like, oh, the shipwreck must have married in with the locals. There is a lot of situations where tribal communities didn't have people get incorporated into their community for a variety of reasons. Some of them, like Moon was mentioning earlier, were familial choices where they didn't want to be caught up into the tribal complex because there were fears of what it may or may not result from it. There are some folks that I know that actually, back in the Kansas area, that had some instances where courthouses burned down with all the birth records. And so all of a sudden there's this entire generation of a community attached to one family that can't get enrolled because there's no record that they were born. And so there are these instances, and unfortunately they don't work in the favor of folks who are Indigenous. So the criteria to get enrolled, because each community differently, sometimes can be really strict.
Okay,
So we got another question from somebody about about Indigenous communities and interacting with them in ways to not create faux pas. And I think this is mostly, I think it's mostly directed towards mannerisms. And so there are some things that I have picked up in my life working with Indigenous communities and having been in one my whole life. There is a tendency for Indigenous community folks to not make eye contact. It's seen as confrontational sometimes to someone that's perceived as older than you. So like if I have an elder speaking to me, I never make eye contact to them when they're speaking directly to me unless they tell me to. And then I will, because I sit and listen until they're done. And there are other things like pointing at people. There are some Indigenous communities that if you point at someone with your finger, the perception is that you're trying to put some kind of voodoo or put a jinx on them or something, or you're cursing them. And so a lot of people won't point with their fingers or their hands, or if they do, they'll make motions. They'll point with their their chins or their lips, right? So somebody will say, hey, what's that over there? And they'll go, oh, you go that way. That's something I've seen a lot with different Indigenous communities. Another one is physical contact. That's one that has always been interesting to me because
they're not huggers.
I'm a hugger with other tribal members or folks that are part of my immediate community. But if somebody I'm not super familiar with comes up and gets me in an embrace, it is touching somebody is like a blessing. So you have to do it with a sense of intent. And so when you're touching somebody, you're putting a part of yourself to them. You want to know who you're talking to. You want to know who you're touching. And you want to make sure that if you're touching somebody, you're not doing something that's going to be like harmful for them, right? So, and it seems like simple stuff, but it could be something as complex as like, when I was in my community, a lot of times I ended up working as a pallbearer. So I had to help people who passed away get taken care of before we put them away. And it was very hard, but it needed to be done. And so when you do that though, you can't touch anybody during the process because death is seen as like a sickness. And so anyone that's around it can have it on them. And so if you touch somebody, you might put that sickness, that death on them. So like you stay away from children, you don't touch other people. Well, it's really complex to discuss. Is touching still a blessing when you're touching them forcefully with a fist? That's much like stick contact, right? When we do our heavy fighting, that is considered a blessing of you forgot to block that.
I have a related question related to martial arts. So you've discussed that there were the copper clubs that were in use. How and the small buckler. What is your preferred weapon for STA combat?
Oh, up till now, I mostly fought either with a center grip round shield or a center grip kind kite shield and basically a 32 to 34 inch sword. I'm going to be obviously changing that for this kit a little bit, and I'll probably be fighting with something like a 30-inch club that'll be shaved and a 20-inch buckler, 18-inch buckler. So that's going to be a slightly new experience. I'm going to look forward to a lot more getting shot in the leg.
The creative design.
Yeah, it'll just show me where all my armor gaps are so I can make sure to fill them.
What is, I believe the saying is leg gaps are the mother of invention.
You know, so when I first started fighting in the SCA, it was here in the Summits, and it was Robert Engelson who put me in armor the very first time. And we were fighting at one event, and it was Baron von Hemedal. He's passed on now. And he put on his armor. And for those who knew him, he always had like hodgepodge armor. It was like made of old purses that he found at the Goodwill. And he would just take the best, most stylized embossed pieces of the leather and put them onto his new harness. And so it was very piecemeal and fun looking. But every time somebody hit him, he'd go, "Oh, that's an armor gap. I'm going to go back to Goodwill." And it was just always hilarious to hear him say that in camp. As he'd, "Oh, there's a gap there. I think that purse broke down." Hopefully I won't be going through that experience. I'm hoping that not only will the quality of the clamons will be better than that, but I'm hoping that I'll learn to use that buckler more effective and control distance. Otherwise, I'm going to be in a world of hurt.
And so I know you discussed the clamons. Is that referring only to the outer layer, or is it an outer layer over? Because I saw there was the diagram with the twisty rods.
The rod armor, the slat armor. It's funny because there's two types of armor. There's the slat or rod armor, and then there's the clamons. And some people use one or the other, and some people use both at the same time. I think for the beginning, I'm just going to use the clamons because I think I can make it look nicer to begin with. And I'm also still trying to experiment with what material is going to work well for a slat or rod armor and not break down. I went and bought some Pacific U. That stuff is like super spendy. And so getting enough of that to construct a slat armor, after I bought several pieces and started doing the dimensions, I started realizing that my budget was not going to meet my desire. So I'm having to reassess and look at a new approach.
If you need some willow, we have a tree we accidentally coppiced, and it's
unfortunately willow will not hold up well.
There's no shortage of willow though. No shortage.
No, I think if I was going to go after something else, I'd probably maybe look at Oregon grape or something like that. There's some other woods that turn in really hard, as they dry out. Oaks, walnut, maybe. So I just need to take some time and look. And I want to do some experiments with striking the wood slats with a stick, a rattan stick, because I want to make sure that I'm not going to have any splinters, obviously, coming off the armor and getting somebody else or me. That'd be the worst thing, to have somebody with like a punctured spleen or something from.
Does Oregon grape really grow big enough to get a substantial amount of wood out of it?
You
said Oregon grape.
No, it would be just rods. I'd just be collecting the rods and then weaving them together. So
okay.
The cordage material was made out of a variety of different things like wild iris and dog's bane and other things. So,
but Marl, Oregon grape can get to be like 8-10 feet tall under good conditions. So
I've seen it tall, but I haven't seen it get thick.
Yeah.
No, you just use as many as the thickest ones as you could, the rods, right? About the size of your thumb. So the lucky thing is when I started doing the research on the armor, there's actually a Tlingit guy who already did all this research on clamons and the slat armor and made a set of it. He works for the National Park Service up in Alaska. So a lot of the stuff that I was going after, I used his research to jump off of because his stuff was more specific to his area. And I was looking for stuff that was more Oregon and Southwest Washington based, where my community of origin is from. So.
Would you say the berries on an Oregon grape are edible?
They are. They're bitter. They're an acquired taste. But you can't.
I mean, I've seen them on an Oregon grape plant, but I am never sure if they're edible. Like if I was out in the woods and I had nothing but Oregon grapes surrounding me, if I ate one of those berries, would I die?
No,
you wouldn't die. But if you're lost in the woods and you don't know where you're at, and you can't stay where you're at, I would just tell you, find bear scat or bear footprints and look at what they're eating. If they can eat it, you can eat it.
Yeah,
Let's
the
see.
only way I know of anybody eating Oregon grape is with a whole lot of sugar added. But it's good
Yeah.
for you. A lot of
You might be
vitamin C.
better off thinking of them as a seasoning rather than a foodstuff.
Yeah, additive. So
Our
does
daughter-
anyone else have any questions?
Well, I was just going to say, we are Native Oregonians in the sense that we're second or third generation. So if you want to come and explore our property, we have lots of Native Oregon plants, and we would love to help.
I could probably identify the foods. I'm always good at identifying food. The rest of it, not so much.
We're down with the experimenting with the seeing which woods work best. And our daughter wants me to tell you, she volunteers her pell if you need something to smack. So.
Aww.
For those folks who are interested in traditional foods here in Oregon, in the local area, that's probably a good conversation to find me in of foods that can be eaten. There are quite a few of them that can be very dangerous. Some of them, like camas, have a product in it called inulin that does not break down in the human body until you cook it long enough. So camas has to be cooked for like 3 to 5 days so that inulin breaks down and becomes a starch and you can eat it. Otherwise, it'll give you huge gastrointestinal problems. Acorns, same thing with tannic acid. You have to leach out the tannic acid before you can eat them. And the more acid you leach out, the sweeter the nut gets. So there are some of these foods that are potentially dangerous. And there are some of them that have, there's one at least that has a photogenic like quality to it, where if you get the sap on you, it will cause like horrible burns. So you have to know exactly how to process that plant. And if you don't, you're gonna hurt yourself like really, really bad. So I always tell people, if you haven't had traditional foods, do it with somebody who's experienced first. Try just a very small amount because you've never had it in your diet and you don't know how it's going to affect you. And then if you enjoy it and you don't have a bad effect, you can work it into your diet as you learn to work with it. But there's some that are easy, right? Grab wild trailing blackberries or strawberries. That's everybody's best friend. But camas, you misidentify it and get the ones with the purple flowers or the white flowers, you're dead.
So what I hear is that I'm going to put your name on our list of people that I'm going to ask when I get my secondary sequence of classes that he's going to arrange for me.
Yes, you should teach a second class.
If we want a specific plant class or something like that, my cousin actually, I have a couple of cousins that are way better at traditional foods and medicines and other things. So if that's something that folks are interested in, we could do that. But I would probably bring in somebody who's a little bit more knowledgeable than me, because I can give enough to make everybody excited and then leave them all disappointed at the end.
I would love to schedule that class, so we'll talk later.
I was going to add on the list of plants that you can eat but be careful. My experience was black elderberry or blue elderberry.
Fred is on here, and I did some field work with him. Fred, Can you pop on?
Fred is the one who asked about parallels between.
Yes. It's been like a decade, and it's like I almost didn't recognize you. I think you had longer hair, and you're looking so good. It's like it looks like you've lost some weight too. So.
About 100 pounds, yeah. Yeah, so we went up to, when I was working on my PhD, Fred and I, working with the BLM, went to Molalla Table Rock. And
yeah.
That's, let me tell you, people who think, having read the novels that cover the apocalypse here in the Willamette Valley, and it talks about the castle being built on top of there. I can't remember the name of the series, but there's no way. That's a huge elevation change over some really rough topography. And we were out there looking for prayer seats, actually. And if you remember, Fred, we did find the one rock feature. And unfortunately, hikers had been using a ceremonial cairn as a place to vacate their vows. And so it was filled up with fecal matter. And as is the way of things in archaeology, you find sometimes really important places and they're important for somebody else, just in a very different way. They wouldn't have known. They couldn't have identified it. So there's no animosity there, right? So it's different if somebody saw it, knew what it was, and went and did it. But in those cases, it's hikers who are out looking for some privacy and they found a moment of it. And good for them, because there's not a lot out there, because it's pretty open territory in a lot of spots.
Okay,
it's tried to
500 years from now, there may be archaeologists who would love to get a sample of authentic hiker fecal matter.
That's true.
Well,
Clovis,
coprolites in Oregon are pretty famous. I mean, we do have a cave where they're like 14,500 years old right over in the desert there. So
I took Jimena on a hike to the top of Table Rock. I told her it was just a couple of miles.
yeah,
So
yeah.
which Table Rock? Molalla Table Rock or the ones in
Molalla
Southern-
Table Rock.
No, Southern
Yeah.
Oregon Table Rock. I am familiar. I am from Southern Oregon. Those are my stomping grounds. No, this was up here, and I didn't realize how much he was lying until we came back down, and I happened to look at the hike posted, the sign there.
Yeah.
Miles.
It's like and it's like 3,000 feet elevation change up and then down.
Yeah.
So the proverbial I had to go uphill both ways fits for that hike actually.
Yes, it does.
And I married him anyway. Yeah, but that is a beautiful area. I'm sure. So I understand the bonding experience you had with Fred. That yes.
Small world.
Yeah, you should join us the next time we have an event. You and Fred can chat it up.
Absolutely. Well, do we have anybody else that has questions, comments, wants to throw a tomato or anything?
Oh no, not at all. I mean, not the tomato throwing. The comments. Thank you. This has been a really fabulous class.
Well, I do have kind of a comment and a question, and it's, the $1 million question. I mean, like I had mentioned before the class start, I mean, in 2016, the society changed the language, which made it more welcoming for Indigenous personas, which I think is a big step. But, this is a journey of 1,000 miles, and it's one step in that. What do you think our next step should be from here?
I think more people who are from ethnicities that are outside of the main core of European identity need to learn to become comfortable in our own skin so that we can bring our cultures or elements of our cultures to share with the broader SCA. I think it will enrich the experience, both for folks that are already actively involved in the SCA for long time periods. I think it'll also reinvigorate things, because I think that there's a lot of things that Indigenous communities can share that are often overseen. And we kind of vaguely mentioned traditional ecological knowledge earlier, but there's a lot of intimate knowledge that people know about harvesting and using plants for a variety of different purposes, including things like dyeing, weaving, things that would be of obvious interest to members of the SCA. And in some communities, are struggling to find enough people that have interest. Not every community. Some have plenty of people that want to weave and learn the language and all that stuff, but there are some that struggle. In my own community, we used to talk about, we would reach out to 100 children. And if we could get one of them interested in working in a culture department, then it was a success, right? 1%, that's all we wanted, 1% of success, because that was enough to keep it from disappearing. And
It's
so
kind of
when
like demo.
it is, it's also kind of sad and overwhelming to feel too sometimes. So, but there are a lot of vibrant cultures that are out there that can bring very new stuff to the SCA that I think is going to be absolutely fantastic for those communities in the SCA. It's just going to be figuring out how to create the space for those conversations to take place and seeing what sharing can happen.
It is going to take quite a bit of research, especially in a time when there was barely anything written down. But I mean, there were.
I would say that that the lack of a written record is often used as the high point of academia to vilify Indigenous knowledge, and being somebody who has worked at academia, I've taught as a professor. I went and worked on getting a PhD. I ended up not finishing it, but
you should finish it.
No, that ship's long sailed. I'm too old and surly for that now. But I've been in the system long enough to know what the conversation topics are and how they shut down those conversations. Here's the reality. If somebody wants to bring Indigenous knowledge into the SCA and there's not something written down, it is not that difficult. Interview the elders of a community. Interview the elders in your own family. I mean, go talk to your auntie and ask her how she makes that basket, or record it, learn how to do it, bring it and show everybody, and show her as your reference, because that is just the same as an author. Exactly the same, right? When we do ethnographic or oral history interviews in cultural resource management things, it's the same thing. Once we interview somebody and we write it down, that person is the reference, and then that report gets to be used for further reference. So if it's not written down, it's only because somebody hasn't done it yet. So be the one to create the paper record for your own family's recordation, you know? And if you want to use the SCA's format to do that, absolutely fantastic. If you don't, then use the system or the way you want to do things and the way you want to interact with the SCA that is best appropriate for you and your community.
And the ANS format for notating oral tradition is almost exactly that. It is literally, I spoke to such and such, they taught me this was done this way.
On this date.
If you can cite, if you can cite a conversation with a scholar, which you can as personal correspondence with so-and-so, then exactly, no reason you can't do that.
I've got more than a few reports out there with just those kinds of references.
Yep.
So.
Yeah.
Well, one of the other things you're going to run into is like comfort levels. It isn't necessarily, white folks' comfort or non-Indigenous folks' comfort with the subject matter. It's the Indigenous person's comfort level in sharing, because that's something that's still theirs.
Yeah, and there's actually a question that kind of comes off of that. When it comes to approaching the culture, how should a non-Indigenous person ask their questions without making the mistakes of citing stereotypes? And I think really the biggest part is to watch on how you phrase your questions, right? So rather than saying, I saw in the movie, or I heard, or in a book I read, go, does your community know how to do X? And how would you go about doing that? Right? You create an open-ended conversation where there can be a share and without an expectation of delivery. I know for like elders in my community, if I want to go speak to somebody and they're being like real, like hardcore traditional, like I'll go over and have coffee with them and like leave a gift and then leave and know that I'm going to have to come back like another 2 times before I'm going to get to the conversation I want to have, because that's the way it's got to be done. I've got to work them up to that moment. And that's the way things work in Indian communities. So if you're trying to bring an Indigenous person into this SCA thing, you're going to have to watch those hesitancies in that negotiation, because the interpersonal communication is so different. And it can be very shocking for a person, especially a res kid who goes into an SCA event the first time, with the amount of noise and the volume of people and the drinking and other things. I mean, we have a very robust community in the SCA that enjoys the company of our fellow Scadians. And so that is a good thing, but it can be overwhelming from somebody who comes from a small community that's accustomed to much smaller, intimate things, and having that many people thrown at them and that loud and big of a venue can be a little bit overwhelming and shocking. Right. I think that's going to be probably a bigger issue.
I mean, I always want to talk to people of other cultures, but I don't know how I can without.
It's, there's not a good answer.
I feel guilty for things that I did not personally do.
So, yeah. And when I used to give history presentations for my tribal community, I used to tell people, and they'd say, I feel guilt for something that somebody else did. You didn't do that. You don't get to own that guilt. The only thing that you're responsible for is making sure that somebody doesn't do it again, right? That's it. Don't let the story die. Don't let it happen again. Outside of that, your responsibilities are met because you didn't do it. Now, are there some injustices that need to be righted? Yes, there are, but inevitably, and so I'm going to get a little esoteric here and I'll apologize. My grandfather used to say something along the lines of, if life was easy, we wouldn't have a reason to be here. And he meant it very dramatically and impactfully, I think, to the way he would present that to me. And I feel that that's still the case even today. Like, I think that life is meant to be difficult because I think we're here to learn things. And that doesn't mean that there aren't beautiful things that happen along with it, but having that perspective from an Indigenous perspective, it means that when I look at things, I look at my responsibilities to my family and my community, then I look to the rights that I get out of that. And when I interact with the dominant culture, a lot of times those things are reversed, right? Because Western culture is very much versed on the concept of what rights I have, and they give me the responsibility to do X, Y, and Z. And in Indigenous communities, you don't have any right. your right to breathe is all you have. What you have is a responsibility to your community and to your family. And by fulfilling that, you get rights that extend your ability to do other things. And so that perspective is, I think, for me, always been like one of the most shocking things to have to come to terms with, because it is so dynamically different, in perspective.
And the rights of those responsibilities can be taken away like that.
And sometimes without any kind of review. Like if an elder comes in, if I was to show up and go to so I don't live on a reservation now, I live 30 minutes away from it. But if I went to the reservation and I went to our plank house and there was ceremony going on and an elder came up and told me that they felt that I shouldn't probably be going in for whatever reason, I probably would do exactly what they said. And it's because that's just what you do. Now, that doesn't settle well with a lot of other people in other cultures, I don't think. Having an elder maybe that's not even related to you telling you what is and isn't appropriate. But in my community, like, you have to kind of live with that expectation sometimes. I don't have a few aunties, I have a community of aunties. I don't have a few uncles, I have a community of uncles, and all of them enrich and complicate my life as much as they can. No.
Well, like a good example, I actually used to work for the state of Kansas for public health, and I got called in to, I did emergency management side of things, and some emergency management officials came in asking, well, how do we go onto the reservation and tell them what to do? And I'm like, you don't. They're like, well, who do we talk to? I'm like, you don't. They're like,
Yeah.
what do you mean? It's like, you ask. You ask if you can talk to someone. You don't say who.
Yeah, and that government to government thing though is like a whole different. So when I've professionally, that's all I do pretty much is like government to government interactions revolving around compliance or projects for tribes. So those things are like a whole different kind of complexity like you're talking about. But like an individual going into a community, in some ways, that's almost more difficult, I think, because they don't have a connection. They don't know who to talk to. They're going to be wandering around randomly. And really, I mean, the only thing you can do is go to the museum if they have one, or their culture center, and ask if somebody's willing to share. But you may get rebuffed or just ignored flat out. Like a lot of places will. They'll just be like, who are you? Whatever. Get out of my way.
Yeah. And so like when I was working, it was like 2010 is a big push for emergency management, mitigation on things, especially in regards to public health, which is very poignant now. But it was, well, who do we go talk to then? I'm like, do you know when the next council meeting is? And they're like, yeah, it's like a month away. I'm like, well, you wait.
Yep.
And then you look and see if it's open.
Yeah. Ask to get on the agenda.
If it's not open, you make a phone call and then you wait. And they're like, well, we need to go in and do that. And like, no, you don't. You wait.
That's one thing I would say for folks that are going to do individual research. If you're going to interact with an Indigenous community, start with their museum or their cultural resources department, but be aware that they are overwhelmed with the volume of work that they have, and they may not respond at all, and they may not respond timely. But that is really going to be your best resource, right? Get it straight from the horse's mouth. Somebody in their community who works for their community with the responsibility around their history and resources. No better place to go.
Do they like it when other people ask about their community? Like, do they like those type of interviews, or would they rather not?
Some do, some don't. I mean, there are some communities like the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians that they actually have a tribal resolution that outside researchers have to get permission from their tribal council before they can do any research in a community. So if you want to do research on their community and have any participation from their government at all, you have to go and petition their council and tell them why it's in their benefit. So when I went to work for my tribe, we started doing archaeological compliance because everybody out there was doing it and writing our history. And I kept saying, why are we not doing the projects and writing our own history? Like this is our story. And so that's where that problem comes in a lot of times, is because so many communities have not had the ability to own their story, or in some cases, the ability to even represent who they are, right? We can look at modern things with the Cleveland Indians and the Redskins football stuff. I mean, right? That every ethnic community gets to identify what is inappropriate with the exception of Native Americans. For some reason, we just have to like, every tribal community's got its own complex set of identity that is both easy and difficult, let alone how that relates to the larger public body. So making generalizations, I'm always very leery about that, because Indigenous communities are just like anybody else. They just want an opportunity to feel comfortable in their own space and be who they want to be and have good relationships with their neighbors. And the problem is that we've had a history that's had a very complex set of interactions. And so those things are not always so cut and dry, you know. Natigiwawa hai umasa yatila kamthadwa pi mithlike kabanagawawa. Just thank you everybody for coming and listening to me talk. I know that I've had some side conversations with a few folks, and I've encouraged them, if they want to directly message me. My name and everything should be on the Facebook stuff, so you should be able to find where I'm at, and just feel free to direct message me if you have questions. If I don't answer right away, I apologize, but I do have a personal professional life. Sometimes it takes over. So, but if people are curious, I want to share. I mean, I don't get very many opportunities, to be honest, in the SCA, where I have been able to give back in a meaningful manner, with the exception of limited opportunities for service. And so getting to share my culture is something that I can feel very proud and comfortable with, because it is mine, and I can feel proud of that. And so if folks want to know about it, I mean, come and talk to me. It's a good excuse for us to have a yarn and get to know each other better.